Okay. So next family of disorders we'll talk about are called the dissociative disorders. We talked a tiny bit about dissociation when I talked about burnout like last week or whenever that was. But these all involve basically kind of a suspension of reality. It's a feeling of like not being real is kind of what unites a lot of these in some ways. The first is called dissociative amnesia. And dissociative amnesia is typically triggered, again, by some sort of like very traumatic event, and often involves a person basically like forgetting very important critical details about their own personal life. So they might forget their name, where they're from, like their family members, etc. This is something that's kind of a trope in like movies and TV shows. So you've probably seen some form of this. And I will say that a lot of these dissociative disorders, particularly this one, are kind of controversial. So sort of, related a little bit to what I was just talking about. But there's some evidence that it might not be real, that dissociative amnesia might not be a real thing, and that most cases where someone has reported dissociative amnesia, they were basically faking it. Kind of the example that comes to my head, have any of you ever seen the show Breaking Bad? That's maybe a little outdated at this point, but there's like a scene or an episode where he basically fakes dissociative fugue to try to cover up, having been involved in some sort of drug situation prior. And it seems like there are cases where that has actually happened in real life, where like someone has committed a crime, they claim that they have dissociative amnesia, and then it goes to court or trial, and it's basically proven that like that's not true, that they actually did remember everything about themselves, they remembered who they were, and they were basically just faking it or making it up. So it's included in the DSM, but there's a lot of controversy if it should be, because it might not actually be a real thing. One that is very real is called depersonalization or derealization, and this relates more to like when I was talking about burnout. So depersonalization or derealization is basically the sensation of like not being present in your own body or in your own life. So it involves basically feeling like dissociated from everything around you. Someone with this might feel like they themselves are not real. They might feel like the world is, like a simulation or something like that, like the world around me isn't real. They might feel like they're in a dream or kind of like a fog state. They often will have kind of like out-of-body experiences. So they feel as if they're kind of viewing their life from a third-person perspective instead of feeling like they're actually in it, living themselves. What else? Was there anything else I wanted to say about that? Don't think so. So that's depersonalization, derealization. And then the third one is dissociative identity disorder, which kind of like dissociative amnesia has a lot of controversy if it is real or not. Dissociative identity disorder at one point in time was called split personality or multiple personality disorder, I think is what it's actually called. Again, something that's often portrayed in like movies or TV shows, so you may have seen, instances of it. But basically with dissociative identity disorder, what happens is the person sort of compartmentalizes themselves into multiple personalities. And those multiple personalities kind of manifest in interesting ways. So that it's almost like they can switch from one personality to the other. Each personality will have its own like name. It might have its own unique voice or accent. It might even have a different gender than the person themselves has. And they basically have like a whole different personality and sometimes backstory behind it. Again, one that maybe might not be real necessarily. So again, there's instances where people have used this as a defense in court and then it's been proven that they're basically making it up or lying. But there does seem to be at least some rare cases where it was a real thing that occurred. For the ones that seem to be real, it was typically for someone who had something very traumatic happen early in their childhood. And they basically use this dissociative identity as like a coping mechanism. So whatever that traumatic thing is that happened, their brain kind of convinces themselves that didn't happen to me, that happened to this other person, who then becomes sort of like their personality, their alternative personality. That they can kind of switch to help them deal with that traumatic situation. But again, quite a bit of controversy. Another reason it's very controversial too In like the 1980s, there was this very sudden spike in diagnoses of dissociative identity disorder. And they kind of like did this study where they traced it back, and they found out there was a book that had been published in like the late 1970s that was really popular. I don't remember the name of the book. I should have written it down. But like dissociative identity disorder was a major part of the plot line of that story. And they found that it was kind of like this fad thing for psychologists to just like, okay, well, I'm going to diagnose my patients with this if they show any sign or symptom, because they had read this book that was really popular and kind of like internalized that, and sort of projected it onto their patients is what it seemed like was happening. Because there was just like this huge spike right after that book was published and became popular, and then it like went down again after a few years. My voice is getting tired, but we're almost at the end. I think we've just got two more kind of families of disorders. So the next one are the personality disorders. And personality disorders are kind of segmented into these three different clusters. So cluster A personality disorders are people who are kind of like odd or eccentric. They can also be a little bit paranoid at times. Each of these clusters have like multiple types within it that I'm not necessarily going to go over, but just for an example, in cluster A, you have the paranoid type. So these are people who have like a really intense mistrust of other people. There's also schizoid and schizotypal, sorry. So schizoid people tend to be like aloof. They're not great at making like social connections. They tend to have very blunted emotions, so kind of like some symptoms of schizophrenia, but not full-blown schizophrenia. Schizotypal tend to have kind of like eccentricities and thoughts, so they have some of those like delusional pieces of schizophrenia, but again, not all of the symptoms of it. So that's cluster A. Cluster B personality disorders tend to be people that are very impulsive and neurotic and erratic. And again, there's multiple personality disorders within cluster B. Two of the main ones are called borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. You've probably heard about antisocial personality disorder in previous DSMs. That would have been labeled as like sociopath or psychopath. So if you ever hear those terms, the DSM term for it is antisocial personality disorder. So people with antisocial personality disorder, they tend to be very like self-indulgent. They don't really care about other people's boundaries. They may just like basically do whatever they want to other people, use other people. They tend to like lie a lot. What else? They often will get into trouble with the law. They might like break laws, commit crimes without really feeling any like remorse or guilt for it. They tend to lack empathy, lack remorse, etc. People with borderline personality disorder, they tend to be very emotionally unstable, and they also tend to have a really unstable self-image. So they might, one day see themselves as like this grandiose godlike figure, and then the next day see themselves as, like much like weaker, kind of low self-esteem. So like their self-esteem fluctuates kind of wildly. So that's cluster B. And in cluster C, personality disorders tend to be people who are very nervous and fearful. So they might be avoidant of social interaction. They often tend to really like fear rejection. They feel inadequate. They have low self-esteem. So those are the personality disorders. Again, those three different clusters. Within each cluster, there's multiple disorders, but I don't want to go through all of them necessarily. All right, and the last family of disorders are neurodevelopmental disorders. These would include ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. I'm not going to talk too much about ADHD because we already talked about that before when we talked about motivation. Autism spectrum disorder, so I already kind of mentioned this, but in previous iterations of the DSM, this was broken up into like, low functioning autism, high functioning autism. Asperger's was a separate thing. Now they're all basically together in this one disorder. And the idea of the spectrum is that it ranges, you know, from very mild to more severe instances of autism. So people with autism tend to have difficulty from a young age forming relationships with other people. They tend to have a difficulty understanding like social norms and things like that. They lack like eye contact. They also tend to have some like speech abnormalities at the very severe end. They can have really severe detriments in their language development. And then, you know, sort of at the lower severity end, their language might be fairly typical or normal, but kind of just like odd or eccentric. They tend to engage in really repetitive behaviors. They might become sort of obsessed with particular topics for a long amount of time and really just kind of obsessively dig into that particular topic and have a hard time like breaking their attention away from it. They also tend to be really sensitive to like overstimulation. So they don't want a lot of sensory stimulation all at once. And they tend to be very sensitive to like any changes in their environment or their routine can make them very emotional. And again, like a lot of the other disorders we talked about, there seems to be a really strong genetic component to autism and some, you know, neurological abnormalities. I think we talked a little bit at some point about mirror neurons. Does that sound familiar at all? So mirror neurons are these neurons that basically fire like whenever I'm doing something or when I'm watching another person do the same thing. So if I take a drink of my thermos, then this neuron would fire, but if I see someone else take a drink, that neuron would also fire. So it's very important for like learning from other people, observing other people, understanding like social interactions. People with autism spectrum disorder tend to have less connections in those mirror neurons. There's some other neurological causes as well that we might talk about next time when we talk about treatment. I think that was pretty much all I had for that. Any questions about any of the disorders that we covered today? Okay.